Please join us in a spirit of meditation and prayer as we deepen into our service and share our opening words for this morning. Stories are for journeying the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. Would Marnie please come up to light the chalice, which is a symbol of the spark of life in each of us. O Spirit of life and love that lives within us and among us, be with us now. Help us take our history into our hearts as well as our minds. Open us so that we can feel our past live in us. The joy, the disappointment, the passion, the pain, the hope. Let the past, all of it, live in the core of our being. Let us be humble. Let us be honest. Help us to take instruction from our past. And let us also be inspired. But more than anything, let us feel your spirit, the spirit of deep compassion, here among us this very moment. O Spirit of love and life, help us to know, truly know, that we are your people, bound together by our collective memory, and more importantly, by our shared aspirations. We are not perfect. We mess up, yet we are drawn together by what we love, by what we hold sacred, and by a vision of what we may yet create together. Finally, gentle and tender Spirit, guide us, inspire us, embolden us, for our work, your work, O Spirit, is not done. Well, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Joyce Conrad, who many of you probably know was a founding member of this congregation 66 years ago now. She had been gone from the Bismarck area for many years. She was in the Washington, D.C. area where she helped found another congregation, which is pretty incredible. I doubt there are too many Unitarian Universalists who have that to their credit. And I'll also say that I had to get this information from her daughter because Joyce is too humble to share any of this with me. She also was a journalist in her career and worked hard at that and was also really politically active. And we are so grateful to have her back with us and to have her speaking today.
The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock almost 400 years ago brought democracy and liberal religion with them to their new home. We Unitarian Universalists are the direct descendants of those pioneering new residents of what would eventually become the United States of America. Nearly 20 years ago, Charles and I began to study the life of Horace Mann, a resident of Boston and a Unitarian born in 1796, who became known as the father of the American public school system. In doing so, I set to work at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. That search led me to also read about the religions of the American colonists and early Unitarianism, hence this report. The religious ferment of the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe began to affect all of England, and the issue of religion became of great concern to ordinary people. Small religious groups began to form in every part of the country, even though dissenters from the Anglican Church could be banished, imprisoned, or even put to death. Along the East Coast at Scrooby, one band of freethinkers attempted to escape to New England in 1607, but failed. A second attempt in 1608, this time to go to Holland, almost failed when the authorities arrived to prevent their escape. Only one ship got away and made it to Amsterdam. Holland had become the haven for Europe's religious dissenters, but the Pilgrims disliked the arguments and the discord of the rival groups in Amsterdam, so within a year they moved on to Leiden, where the university was the center of a new Arminian movement. The Arminians opposed strict Calvinism and believed in universal redemption and free will. They held that each individual has a relationship with God and did not need an intermediary. The Pilgrims lived and worked in Leyden for about 10 years, and then they found that their children were becoming into the culture, and so they decided to move again. The Pilgrims resolved by the time they had landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, the Pilgrims had adopted democratic governance and the principle of the separation of church and state. In the Mayflower Compact, they declared they were forming a civic body politic. Their spiritual leader, however, remained in Leyden, and for a number of years they operated without one, perhaps very much like a UU fellowship. Meanwhile, a larger religious movement had evolved in England that they too accepted only the Bible as their authority, but they didn't want to leave the church, just to purge it of its corruption, and they wanted to live a pure Christian life. For that reason, these English dissenters came to be known derisively as Puritans. Their preachers roamed the countryside, giving lectures and gaining considerable middle-class support. When King Charles I married a Spanish Catholic in 1625, the Puritans gave up hope. In 1629, they secured a charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, in which they explicitly asserted their adherence to the Church of England. A small number arrived in Salem that winter, and then in March of 1630, 1,000 settlers left England for Salem. At first, Puritans were unwilling to associate with the liberal separatists of Plymouth, but when members of the vanguard became ill, they welcomed their help, and a few months later they invited the Pilgrims to the first service in their new church. In the following 10 years, 1630 to 1640, 18,000 English, mostly Puritans, came to New England. These were largely very literate, middle-class people. A high percentage had attended university. 6 years after these first settlers arrived, they established Harvard College. The Puritans had a communal outlook. Private landownings were small, and the community owned large common areas such as Boston Commons, where cattle once grazed. They believed the individual should sacrifice for the good of the whole, but they were not egalitarians. Men of rank should act responsibly and with proper modesty, and the lower classes were to respect the upper classes. Church and state were partners. Church attendance was mandatory, and the preachers delivered intense sermons of fire and brimstone. Mankind is thoroughly depraved. Salvation cannot be earned, but is a gift from God. But Puritans held an overriding fear of creating a hierarchy. Every town, called a parish, had a tax-supported first church, and that congregation was autonomous. Thus, the word congregational came to be used for these Puritan churches. The parish church asked for voluntary contributions, but if they didn't get enough, taxes paid the rest. The practice was most common in small towns or small parishes, and never in Boston. There was no creedal requirement for Puritan church membership. Members had to live a good Christian life, and they faced excommunication for failing to do so. Only members in good standing could vote in the town elections. Carrying out these directives caused considerable discomfort, and over time the Puritan churches modified their rigidity, but not without considerable conflict. It is estimated that by the time the Puritans began to expand the franchise, less than 15% of the adult males in the colony could vote. In 1684, the King of England revoked the colony's charter and appointed a royal governor who insisted on the Anglican worship and erected King's Chapel in Boston. By this time, Massachusetts residents also included Quakers, Baptists, and Universalists. The early 1770s also saw a gradual liberalization of the Puritan clergy. In Plymouth, the few Pilgrim churches had come to be dominated and in time almost absorbed by the Puritan theocracy, but they always allowed for theological difference, and they took the liberal side of every issue. By mid-century, three parties of Congregationalists existed in the colony: the very strict New Line Calvinists, the Old Line Calvinists, and the liberals who rejected the Calvinist belief in human depravity. By the time of the American Revolution, the earliest Pilgrim and Puritan families had been in this new country for 5 or 6 generations, about 150 years. As the Revolution approached, the issues and the actions of the coming war interrupted the religious controversies that had been going on for all of these years, and it wasn't until 1790s that it would resume. The new American Constitution, the newly minted slogan, "No taxation without representation," and the Bill of Rights forced the Puritans of Massachusetts to change their attitude about state and church. Because of the directive of the new Constitution, voters in the towns acquired the power to elect the pastor of the church. As a result, a new religious controversy developed, and the churches began to change. In fact, the liberals were too successful. In 1787, King's Chapel in Boston called a liberal minister. In 1805, Old Plymouth Church called a liberal, causing the conservatives to withdraw. Also in 1805, liberals elected 2 prominent Harvard educators, the college president and the principal professor of its divinity school. Responding to this threat, the Calvinist faction patched up their differences long enough to start Andover Theological Seminary, and in liberal Boston, the conservatives organized the Park Street Church. The conservatives also refused to attend the ordination of liberal ministers, and they created institutions bringing together the various factions of the Calvinists. At this juncture in Dedham in 1818, when a conservative minister resigned, the liberals in the town decided it was time to test the Bill of Rights. After all, they were paying church taxes, so they called a town meeting and elected a liberal minister. When church members protested, the town called a council meeting, which of course was stacked with the liberals. The Orthodox had a majority of the membership, but the liberals had the law. The conservatives withdrew, moved across the street, and sued to reclaim their property, the church property. 2 years later, the Massachusetts court ruled the parish, not the church members, had the power to select the minister, and they retained ownership of the property. As a result of the Dedham decision, parish after parish in eastern Massachusetts called liberal ministers, and in one town after another, the displaced Orthodox members founded second churches. By 1836, 81 churches had divided, and Orthodox members had left, leaving the liberals holding the church property. By 1840, Massachusetts counted 135 Unitarian churches and 409 Congregational churches. But the victory for religious freedom had been won at great cost. Strong words were used. The liberals were called robbers and infidels, while the Orthodox were looked upon as bigots and fools. The Orthodox boycott of the liberals continued, forcing liberal ministers and laymen to begin to organize. And in 1825, the liberals founded their own denomination, taking the name Unitarian as their own. The union of church and state, so long defended by the Orthodox, had become an engine of destruction. Orthodox opposition to complete religious freedom now came to an end. In 1827, with strong Orthodox support, the Massachusetts legislature banned the use of sectarian textbooks in the public schools. And in 1833, it officially disestablished the Congregational Church. The Pilgrims and the Puritans had come to New England as religious dissenters and as settlers, and even as the Puritans adopted a state church, they were fiercely determined not to create a hierarchical church. For all their faults, they never wavered from that conviction. But the state church they created could not respond to the changing beliefs of a very large part of their congregations. The Unitarians of New England had no desire to organize a separate denomination, but they did when they found it to be their only alternative. The Universalists had already become separatists, and it is not surprising that these Pilgrim-inspired churches also became separatists and organized the American Unitarian Association. As Unitarian Universalists, therefore, we are the inheritors of this overpowering desire of these two groups to have religious freedom. As I was editing this report, I thought to myself, why would this story be relevant to today's religious liberals, you who are here? The timeline is very long. The Pilgrims brought democracy and liberal religion to their new home almost exactly 400 years ago. But it wasn't until 1776, 150 years later, that the colonists declared the creation of a democratic society. And then, we the people meant we white men. It took 200 years for the liberal religionists of New England to establish themselves as a separate denomination, and it took another 10 years for Massachusetts to agree to the separation of church and state. Here we are, 400 years later, still a minority surrounded by a sea of Orthodox, although the religious wars are nothing like they used to be. And we, the people, has expanded to include women and people of color, although we still must struggle to guarantee that our democracy include everyone. I guess that is the reason the Pilgrim story is important. It is that this is an never-ending pilgrimage that we are on.
Those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of the horizons of their vision, we too dream. Let us go remembering to praise, to live in the moment, to love mightily, to bow to the mystery.